Welcome, everybody, to another session at Eightfold AI's Cultivate 21. I'm here with Paul Marca and Steve Hunt, and we're going to be talking about education and learning in business and how it's been shifting over the last few years. Why don't we start by asking Paul to introduce himself? Paul?
Thanks very much. Delighted to be here. Paul Marca, I'm principal at Parallax Global Advisors and spent the majority of my career, 32 years at Stanford University, really trying to build education programs for industry. So really working at the intersection between what the university can deliver to industry, professional executive education, graduate education, as well as content and that is customized and tailored to industry needs.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. It's nice to meet you. Steve?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Steve Hunt. I am a chief expert for work and technology at SAP in their innovation office. My focus is on the intersection of workforces, technology, and business performance. So my background, I'm actually an industrial organizational psychologist by training, but I've spent my career focused on the use of technology to create more effective work environments, better employee experiences, more agile organizations, things like that.
So let's jump in. The nature of learning and how it's shifting, where it's going. Let's start with where we are today. What is the nature of learning in the business world today? How's it being developed? How's it used? Paul?
I would say that pre-COVID, I think learning was really interesting in industry. Organizations really needed to focus on how to improve people for outcomes, except the time horizon was much, much longer. In terms of COVID, what's happened is online education has really evolved, especially in the higher education space. I don't know if you've seen, but recently 2U, a provider of graduate education, high-priced education, partnered with and purchased edX, which is a purveyor of low-cost global access to content, working with many university providers. And I think one of the trends that I see is content is a commodity. And so it's important for companies, especially, to think about what outcomes they would like to create. How do you leverage this sort of emerging commitment and interest in global and online education to service the next generation of leaders and engineers in companies?
Steve, what do you think?
Well, I definitely agree with what Paul said. I think at a broader level, and my work focuses broadly. I look a lot at learning and education, but I look more broadly at how to create effective, agile organizations and workforces. And there's two things that are happening that I refer to as tectonic changes in the nature of work. That is, they're underlying shifts that are driving all kinds of changes at the top, particularly around learning. And the two changes are, one, the accelerating pace of change created by digitalization, that because of digitalization, as the world gets more connected, more automated, what have you, things are changing faster and faster and faster and faster. So companies that used to focus primarily on productivity in the workforce now have to focus on adaptability. And psychologically, that's very, very different in terms of how you manage a workforce. We're most productive when we're doing stuff we've already learned how to do. Whereas when we're managing people to be adaptable, we have to manage them that taps into people's innate ability to learn, which I think is important to remember. That one of the big myths about people is that we fear change. We don't. We fear poorly managed change. But actually change, the ability to adapt to changing environments, is the fundamental niche of humans as a species. It's called learning, and we're really good at it in the right conditions. And that is one of the big changes in workforce management, is we have to create these conditions that enable constant learning in an organization. The other thing that's interesting, particularly around harder skills, is we are entering a world and it's been steadily moving to this for decades, of really radical labor shortages. Critical, not shortages of people, but shortages of people with specialized skills. Because again, as the world gets more digitalized, jobs get more specialized. But what's been happening behind the scenes is we've been having a lot fewer children. So a lot of the labor shortages that are being talked about right now have been predicted for decades. And it's because for the first time in history, we're reaching a point where more people are leaving the labor market than entering the labor market because of the children we didn't have 20 years ago. It's hard to fix that, by the way. But what this means is companies used to be able to kind of rely on a steady supply of a lot of people coming into the labor market and leave it to people to figure out how to train themselves. That's really changed because of this fundamental demographic shift that's requiring companies to deal with what is really just a chronic and growing shortage of people with skilled labor. Again, it's not a shortage of people. It's a shortage of people, and we need to teach these. It's a shortage of people with pre-existing skills. So learning is becoming a critical part of staffing.
So let me ask a follow-up. You mentioned about how the speed of learning is picking up and is getting quite fast, faster than it's ever been before. And at the same time, people have to learn more. Is it sustainable? Are people going to be able to keep up?
I'll answer then, Paul. I'm really curious to get your thoughts on this. I believe, yes, it is sustainable. As a matter of fact, the way we did work before was unhealthy. It's not healthy to do the exact same thing over and over and over again. It's not healthy mentally nor physically to some degree. You need to exercise and learn. And when we learn, it's really enjoyable if it's in the right conditions. So I think it is sustainable, but not if we try to apply the management and learning practices of the past for a future that's very, very different in terms of this idea of constant, continuous learning through your entire career. Paul, what do you think on that? I know this is right at the heart of what you study.
It's a great point, and I just want to sort of bring some sort of practical perspective to this. A number of years ago, the center that I directed at Stanford, the Stanford Center for Professional Development, had and still has a graduate program, a very exclusive. If you get admitted to Stanford, you can take this offer. What we saw was that we were rejecting 8 in 10 people who still needed education. They needed to reskill, and so we created smaller chunks of education, certificate programs, and then we continued with professional non-credit offerings so that these learners could remain in the workforce and become vibrant employees in their particular organizations, maybe shift and so on. But I think I agree with you, Steve. The pace of change is dramatic and fast. And I think that the big concern that I have for my former employer, Stanford University, is that the trends and the legacy of the higher education, where a lot of great knowledge resides, won't be able to keep pace with the rapid change required for reskilling people. We talk at Stanford about the T-shaped individual, that person who has great depth and has broad perspective. These are the employees that you want, except I would argue that now you're going to need a lot more T's. You're going to need many, many more sort of depth dimensions to your career, because those things will be changing very rapidly. So the good news is there are lots of third-party providers in the absence of higher education being aggressive and addressing this opportunity that are coming to the fore to be able to answer the call for this reskilling opportunity that I definitely see emerging over the next 5 to 10 years.
It used to be you had to go to a classroom to learn. You had to go to colleges to learn. And now it's like, no, you can learn anywhere you have access to the internet. And, I'm not saying there isn't value in in-person learning. There is, but there was a lot of stuff that we used to require people to travel, spend money, cost to go to learning institutions, which really, in some cases, could have been better done on the internet using micro-learning, remote learning technologies. So I'm not saying we don't want to still get back into classrooms, but we were over applying the old way of learning that, didn't really take advantage of technology. So I think so you're seeing this now, learning happening more in the workplace itself. I think at a even larger level, which we haven't gotten to yet, but I think is a much broader societal shift, is we need to rethink the whole way we think about learning over the course of our life. Historically, we sort of had a model of you do most of your learning before you're about 25, and then you graduate, and then you apply your knowledge that you learned and maybe fine tune it, but basically do the same thing for the next 40 years, and then you retire and then you die. That's not the way the world is moving. I don't think it was necessarily even a good way to be, but if you think about it, I think in the future, ideally, there are 2 words that we're going to get rid of. Sort of like, we used to talk about serfs and indentured servants and other words for work that no longer apply in the modern world. 2 things we're going to get rid of are the words graduation and retirement. Because I think increasingly it's going to be, look, you're going to have a blend. And you're already seeing this happen where schools are finding ways to get people out in the working world much, much earlier. And people that are working are also going to school. And it's kind of a continuum where kind of shifting from acquiring knowledge to applying knowledge and applying knowledge to acquire, which really support each other very well. But we're going to blend these things together more and more. So we won't graduate. We'll just sort of transition, nor will we retire. This is the other big change. We're living much, much longer. Like in the last 90 years, the average life expectancy in the United States has increased by about 33 years. So this idea that, oh, I'm going to retire at 65 and sit around for 30 years and do nothing is not healthy. It actually is unhealthy, but you should have a reason to get up in the morning. But the reality is that people don't necessarily want to work the same way, but people want to contribute. They want to be part of something. So I think we're going to get rid of graduation, retirement, and move to just constant transition, constant movement. That's what I believe will happen. I believe it needs to happen, but it requires really fundamental rethinking the nature of some concepts in society. And we have to remember, graduation and retirement are made-up constructs. It wasn't like it was natural. The concept of retirement being tied to age was created in the late 1800s. It used to be people worked until they didn't work anymore. But it wasn't necessarily, that's not necessarily a bad thing if the work is a good experience.
One of the things that I love, Steve mentioning this notion of what my colleagues and I in the higher ed space talked about, which is sort of a 60-year degree, not just a 4 or 8-year degree, and really thinking about what that means and the implications for higher ed. I have to say that some universities, Arizona State, Southern New Hampshire, are really moving aggressively to address this really interesting and frankly quite expansive market. By some estimates, it's 100 billion to 300 billion in the U.S. alone. As many universities struggle, there's enormous opportunity to really address both a need for reskilling and a desire on behalf of companies all over the globe to help reskill and retool at the speed of business rather than at the speed of higher ed, which I have some doubts about whether those adjustments can be made.
Mark, you're not going to have a chance to ask any questions because we keep building off of each other. No, I love that idea of the 60-year degree, or it should be, I'd say it's the lifelong degree. And I guess just one last point on that too. Not only is this important for businesses to start thinking this way in educational institutions, it's important that people need to think this way. Because somebody asked me once in the medical professions, learned what I did and said, what can I do to create employment security so that my job is not automated away and I'm not replaced by a robot? And my answer to her was, make sure that you're always learning something new. Because as soon as you say, I know how to do my job, it means you have figured out the repetitive parts of your work. And as soon as your work becomes repetitive, that is, you've learned it, it can become automated. So always be focusing on doing something at work that's requiring you to learn new things, because that's the stuff that's changing, and the stuff that's changing is the stuff that can't be automated.
Now, this shift, what was COVID's impact on it? And the reason I ask is because it seems a lot of people had to suddenly learn some new things, were put in unexpected positions. The crisis is still with us, even though it seems to be easing. But Steve, could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the people that study sort of the future of work, of which I probably am a member of that community, and they talked about COVID, most people said it accelerated things. It did not change the direction of work in organizations. It just pressed fast forward on it. I remember talking to one of our retail customers who said, yeah, we implemented our online strategy from 5 years, our 5-year strategy, we implemented in 3 weeks. Just everything happened much faster. The same thing with move to remote work, hybrid work. I think what it's done is it has forced companies to challenge a lot of these long-standing assumptions. So like when you think about this idea of where do we learn, we had this sort of assumption that, it's natural to go to a university, or it's natural to leave the workplace or go to in-person training. And again, forgetting that there's nothing natural about that. An office building is a form of technology. It was a form of technology created about 1790 to facilitate collaboration, communication, learning development, things like that in large organizations. And it was developed in 1790 by the British Admiralty, taking into account the communication, development, and learning technology available in 1790. And then we just continued to use it and overuse office buildings as though somehow they were a natural way to work. They weren't. If we'd always had the internet, we never would have had learning universities, classrooms, buildings the way that we've had in the past. So what happened is the COVID pandemic forced leaders in particular, and I think it's leaders more than employees, to really say, hey, all these assumptions you had about how work is supposed to work are based on outdated concepts, outdated technology. And it's forced companies to really take a really positive and serious look at these assumptions.
And I think, Mark, for higher ed, space that I know a little bit about, I think COVID legitimized online education. Previously, the group that I ran, it was the Stanford Center for Professional Development we were the pioneers in creating online degree programs in 1996. And it was a nice to have. It was sort of off to the side, a unit that did really interesting work impacting Silicon Valley companies and so on. Except that COVID required that entire universities, really the entire field of learning from K to Gray, move online, because that was the only way content could be delivered around the globe. And so it really did legitimize and accelerate the trend of online education. Now, I think the fear that I have is the pendulum swing will be all the way back to the in-person experience, because frankly, humans need that, and we enjoy the in-person contact. I'm hopeful, though, that we can benefit and take advantage of the learning that we had as we moved all the way across to the entirely online, and temper the pendulum swing so that we might be able to take advantage of those technology enhancements, the expansion of the market that can benefit from the great work in higher education, and as well create new opportunities to address learners that universities don't normally consider traditional learners.
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, I have a lot of conversations with customers about hybrid remote work in general. I think the point is we have a much more mindful use of in-person learning, in-person office space. So it's not like we're not going to get back together, because we have to remember what we've experienced for the last 12 months or so is not normal remote learning. It's physical isolation. A healthy remote hybrid work environment and learning environment involves getting together with other people in person, but in a very intentional way, not just all coming so we can all sit in the same room and stare at a professor not talking to each other. We can do that remotely.
That's a great point.
With these shifts, we've been talking about them sort of from the focus of the employer, but how about the employee? How much are they driving some of these changes? And are they doing it because they're seeing good business reasons or professional reasons to do it, or are there other factors?
I think this is being driven by both sides. First of all, if there's one thing that universally employees want, is they want flexibility and freedom, and they want transparency. And those two kind of go together. They want transparency around what are the opportunities, what do you want me to do, how do you decide if I'm contributing to the company? So real transparency around, their role and how they're evaluated and things like that. But they also want flexibility to do work in a way that makes sense for them. And so that's probably what this has done, is this whole move to hybrid remote work has enabled, employees to have far more flexibility. And you see this as companies are going back into the office. The companies that are saying, oh, you must come into the office every day, a certain amount, are seeing turnover. I mean, I've had companies where like entire IT departments have quit. They say, no, I don't have to do this. Other people won't force me. It's not that I don't want to get back in person, but I want to do it in a way that's intelligent, not just do it just to do it. On the company side, this is a huge benefit in general for companies, because they're saying, wow, now we can save a lot of money on office space. We can reallocate it. We can provide a better experience for our employees. We can source people more broadly regardless of geographic location. So there's a lot of advantages for businesses. It is still a struggle for a lot of leaders, though, because a lot of leaders are like, hey, I was comfortable with the old way. I was successful when everyone was in front of me. And it does require much better leadership when you're actually managing people based on what they do and not where they sit. And so That's where I think you're seeing some of the resistance from leaders. It's not that employees don't want it or doesn't make sense to the company. It's just that leaders were comfortable with the way it was. And they're having to realize, which is positive, the way it was isn't going to be the way it's going to be, which is a good thing.
I might take a stab at in higher ed. What we see is a shifting from universities as faculty-centered organizations now to a much more sort of student-centered experience based on COVID. Keep in mind that I mentioned earlier, education content is a commodity, and so students now have choice. They can look online for their own university, if you're alumni, or to the likes of Coursera and edX and so on, to Stanford founded startups. And I really think that there are great opportunities to think differently. In addition, Steve mentioned earlier that, sort of employees there is a war for talent. And I think that war will start to shift the energy from the employers to the employees in terms of, and you see some of this, these unusual benefits to hire folks. And I think that trend will only continue. So the COVID has had that shift to really try to move from, I would call it sort of organization centric to really employee centric. And I think there are tons of implications for leadership. I think it also for employers, the globe is your oyster. You really can hire from around the globe, and a key to the success, as Steve mentioned, will be leaders adapting to integrate teams that are globally diverse, and really, I think, with an eye toward diversity, equity, and inclusion, start to adjust and adapt their work patterns and their work styles to meet the employee needs.
Well, I think this is kind of a follow-up in some ways, but where is all this going? It's shifts have to end somewhere, don't they? And
learning is going to be absolutely critical on a going forward basis. It's the sort of lifelong learning 60-year degree. And I think, wouldn't it be great if some sort of system could assess where I am, what I need to learn for the next job to optimize my skills and abilities for my own community, family, and so on. And by doing so, what if I could really realize a great potential for the company for whom I work? Or better yet, what if the company could help me find a safe landing somewhere else, right? Too often now, as people are shifting careers, they have to leave a company in order to realize their full potential. Now, that may be a function of lots of different things, but I think there's an opportunity for companies to get far more intelligent around background that I have and the things that I might be able to do to support a future state, so that you can retain employees in this sort of war for talent. And you can also think clearly about optimizing for future growth and future roles, creating a loyalty that would be unbelievably great, and I think is severely lacking in the working world. Steve, I'm curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with what you're talking about. I think you're providing much better tools for people to understand what they should be learning, want to learn, and connect them to it. We're already seeing this happen, right? You mentioned earlier, companies are really going away from having centralized learning programs to really using technology to connect people with organic learning. And a lot of that comes from their colleagues. One of the biggest innovations in learning technology in the past 10 years has been social learning technology, where it enables people to learn from other people. I mean, the best personal example of that is YouTube. How many of us have gone out on YouTube, found some person who could have been us, who's teaching us how to do what it is we want to learn? And companies are using technology like that, creating learning communities, and about connecting people together and making learning more of a social activity. The larger, if I step back to the larger societal thing, I mean, this is a much bigger topic, but I think, how long will this last? I see no reason this is ever going to stop. Is the pace of, it used to say the only constant is change. Now the only constant is an accelerating pace of change. Things are just moving faster and faster and faster. And that can be good if we approach it the right way. And I don't see any reason why it's necessarily going to slow down, nor do I think we're going to reverse the trend for people to have fewer children, for a variety of reasons. So we have to get far better at managing and creating societies that are focused on ongoing lifelong learning and constant reskilling and helping employees move from one job into new jobs as the world changes, as opposed to feel like they've been isolated because the skills they had in the past aren't valuable in the future. So we really need to think about that. I think a lot of companies are leading the way. Where I get concerned, to be honest, is a lot of our societal norms, government regulations, things like that are not designed for a world where we're constantly shifting and moving jobs and changing employers into our 80s. They're designed with this idea, still they're rooted in this model of you go to school till you're 25, you work largely at the same company for 40 years, you retire and you die. We aren't designed and set up for, the tax implications legally, how corporations, how we do healthcare, all this stuff isn't designed to enable people to take risks, move around, try different jobs. It's not it doesn't help companies with it. It doesn't help employees. We still have a lot of laws that are tied to a much more assumption that the world is far more stable than it is now. I read an interesting article recently where it talked about how companies have all these things to bring new talent into the organization, internships, job sharing, bring people from school into work. Yet we just treat retirement like a cliff. Thank you, boom, you're gone. Where if you talk to most people, particularly in professional jobs, even more so, there's a lot of their work that they like. But they don't want to do it the same way. As you get older, your economic situation changes, to some degree your physical health may change, but it doesn't mean people want to just turn their brains off. And so why don't we have transition programs for moving out of the workforce the same way we have all these transition programs for moving into it? Let's, why do we treat it like this all or nothing cliff? I think it's bad for people, it's bad for societies, and we need this talent. I mean, if people have skills, the big drive of these labor shortages, and is also driving focus on inclusion, regardless of gender, ability, ethnicity. We need talent. We need skilled people in the workforce. And so we want to make sure we remove those barriers. On the government one too, I think on education, that's a really interesting one. And if you look, I'll use the example Singapore, and I'm not an expert on Singapore, but I've read a few things about it. I've been there a few times. It's interesting that because if you look at what they did as a society, is they realized we're this tiny little island nation. We really don't have any natural resources. The one thing we have is a really good geographic location and a workforce. And they have invested heavily in educating their workforce to make them a desired place to locate corporate headquarters because they have a highly skilled workforce. I think that's something where, at least in the US, there's a tendency to view education as like a reward that people should pay for. And, why should some people get free education and other people shouldn't? We shouldn't view it that way. We should view it like electricity or public roads or drinking water. It's better for our society to educate as many people as possible because it makes our society more adaptable and flexible. Not viewing education as this scarce resource that you have to earn. We should be focusing on doing everything we possibly can to give people as much education as they can possibly consume, because it's better for all of us.
I just want to jump on this notion. I can't help but think that your retirement comment, Steve, is kind of like a university graduate. Get out. We got another group coming in. Please don't bother us, and we'll call you when we need some money. That sort of feels kind of like retirement. How can there was a concept that Stanford shared on the 2025 sort of open loop university. How can we create on ramps and off ramps for graduates to come back to their university, their first stop, to get re-educated as they need reskilling throughout their careers? With regard to Singapore, it's an unbelievable example. And I think governments need to be sort of enlightened about the possibilities, even in spite of the potential costs. And this is where higher ed, I think, as education becomes a commodity, the business model is going to be put under pressure. Because I'm not going to take $100,000, $200,000 debt when actually some of the courses are on edX or Coursera, and they're pretty good. And my employer might actually create their own education so I can get a job directly and learn as I go and grow.
I think that's really interesting. We're really rethinking about it, and we can commoditize a lot of this education, and we should get it out. It goes, I remember somebody told me years ago, you don't want to be surrounded by people that are uneducated. It's not good for them. It's not good for you. we want to educate our broader population as much as we possibly can.
I've been talking with Paul Marca and Steve Hunt. It's Cultivate 21, and I'm Mark Feffer.